In a time when snow fell like a heavy shroud over forgotten realms, Grandfather Ilara, with calloused hands and a heavy heart, dragged himself up the icy slope of the cursed hill. His grandson, little Leo, shivered beneath tattered rags, fever burning his pale skin. They had been banished, mercilessly expelled by the cruel Lord Valerius, who condemned them to the uncertain fate of that desolate land. The only visible refuge was the ghostly silhouette of an abandoned Gothic chapel, its broken, stained glass windows like empty eyes staring at the grey sky, where the wind howled songs of despair. The cold was a relentless enemy, and hunger a constant shadow. But hope, however faint, still burned in the old man's chest, a silent promise to the memory of his beloved wife. With each step, the blizzard's icy wind seemed to tear a piece from Grandfather Ilara's weary soul. His eyes, blurred by snow and unshed tears, could barely make out the path beneath his feet. But the silhouette of the Gothic chapel, now closer, was a beacon of despair and the only promise of shelter. Leo, the small grandson, was a light burden in his arms, but the weight of the fever consuming him was unbearable. Each weak whimper from the boy pierced the old man's heart, a melody of pain mingling with the wind's howl. His body protesting with every fiber, Ilara reached the base of the hill where the chapel stood, a somber, forgotten sentinel. Its wrought-iron gates were rusted and ajar, inviting entry, but also desolation. The grandfather pushed them open with an effort that seemed to drain his last energies, and the sharp creak echoed like a lament in the icy air. The interior was a tomb of dust and shadows, where time had stopped centuries ago. Broken stained glass windows allowed snowflakes to dance in the thin air, and the pale light of the dying afternoon revealed overturned pews, mutilated statues, and an altar covered by a shroud of cobwebs. Ilara found a corner relatively protected from drafts, where the snow had not invaded. With extreme care, he laid Leo on a piece of cloth he had brought, covering him with his own worn cloak. The boy shivered uncontrollably, and his skin burned to the touch. His lips were cracked and dry, and his breathing shallow and irregular. "Water," Ilara murmured, his voice hoarse and broken. "He needs water." But the chapel, a monument to forgotten faith, offered not even a drop. Despair threatened to swallow the old man. He scanned the surroundings with his eyes, searching for anything that could alleviate Leo's suffering. It was then that, in a darker corner, almost hidden by piles of rubble and a fallen statue, he noticed a low, circular structure. As he approached, wiping away the dust with his hand, Ilara realized it was a fountain, or what remained of one. It was dry, completely clogged by a thick layer of dark sludge and debris accumulated over ages. A spark of hope, however faint, ignited in the grandfather's chest. Perhaps if he could clear the sludge, there would be an underground spring, a forgotten source. With his calloused hands, Ilara began to dig. The sludge was cold and sticky, clinging to his nails and beneath his skin. Every movement was torture for his aching muscles, but the image of Leo's pale face, the fever consuming him, was the fuel that propelled him. He scraped, dug, and pulled, ignoring the pain, the cold, and the exhaustion that dragged him toward the abyss. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes. Ilara had lost all sense of time. His hands were raw, sweat mixed with dirt on his face, just as exhaustion threatened to overcome him as the darkness of night already swallowed the chapel and hope faded like smoke. A soft, bubbling sound emerged from the bottom of the fountain. It was not the sound of water. With a final effort, Ilara removed the last piece of sludge, and what emerged was not water, but a luminous, golden-red liquid, radiating a soft light and a sweet, intoxicating aroma, like nectar and spices. It flowed slowly but steadily, filling the small fountain basin with an almost ethereal glow. Grandfather Ilara looked at it with disbelief, his eyes wide. It was as if heaven itself had poured its essence into that forgotten place. A word whispered in his mind, an ancient legend his grandmother used to tell on winter nights. The wine of angels. They said it was a miraculous elixir, capable of curing any illness, even the Black Death that ravaged kingdoms, and that its value exceeded that of the purest gold. Still in shock, Ilara hesitated. Was this a mirage, a trick of his exhausted mind? But Leo's weak whimper brought him back to reality. There was no time for doubt. With trembling hands, he dipped his fingers into the warm, glowing liquid. It was soft to the touch, almost silky. He gathered a small portion and with the utmost delicacy brought it to Leo's dry, cracked lips. The boy swallowed a little, and the effect was almost instantaneous. The pale color of his face began to return, a healthy flush replacing the feverish pallor. His breathing, previously ragged, became calmer and more regular. His eyes, which had been glazed and unfocused, slowly opened, now clear and alert. Leo blinked, looked at his grandfather, and a faint but genuine smile appeared on his lips. "Grandfather," he whispered, his voice still weak, but without the hoarseness of fever. "I'm thirsty, but I don't feel cold anymore." The tears Ilara had held back for so long finally rolled down his aged face, not from sadness, but from overwhelming relief. The miracle had happened. They had found not just water, but the very essence of life. The wine of angels flowed, a promise of healing and, perhaps, a future Ilara had never dared to dream of. But the glow of that precious liquid also brought with it a shadow. A treasure of such magnitude could not remain hidden for long, especially from greedy eyes like those of Lord Valerius. Salvation had arrived, but with it a new and dangerous journey. The golden red light of the wine of angels pulsed in the fountain, a heart beating in the forgotten chest of that chapel. Ilara's tears, warm and salty, mingled with the cold sweat on his aged face, a silent testament to a miracle that defied the very logic of existence. Leo, little Leo, now breathed with the calm of deep, restorative sleep, a healthy flush returning to his previously pale cheeks. The grandfather, his fingers still damp with the elixir, touched his grandson's forehead. The fever had vanished, replaced by a soft, comforting warmth. His skin, once dry and cracked, was soft to the touch. It was as if life itself had been reinfused into the boy's fragile body. "Grandfather?" Leo murmured again, a genuine, sleepy smile on his lips. "I'm hungry." Those words, so simple and mundane, were the sweetest melody Ilara could have heard. Hunger, thirst, cold. All of it was still a cruel reality. But the most terrible threat, the illness that stole his grandson's life, had been banished. The relief was so overwhelming that for a moment Ilara felt his legs weaken. He knelt beside Leo, stroking his hair, tears flowing freely. The wine of angels was not a legend. It was the purest and most potent reality he had ever witnessed, but with mental clarity also came the shadow of understanding. That bright, miraculous liquid was a treasure of inestimable value. His grandmother had whispered stories of kings and emperors who would give entire kingdoms for a single drop, of the Black Death retreating before its power. If the cure for the disease that ravaged lands and populations was there, gushing from a forgotten fountain, the world would go mad to possess it. And the world, for Ilara, was personified in the cruel and greedy figure of Lord Valerius. The grandfather looked at the fountain, at the constant, gentle flow of the golden wine. It was a blessing, yes, but also a disguised curse. How to protect it? How to protect Leo? The blizzard outside continued to howl, a white curtain that for now isolated them from danger. But isolation was a double-edged sword. It also prevented them from seeking help or fleeing. Leo's hunger brought Ilara back to the more immediate reality. The wine of angels healed, but it did not nourish. The cold of the chapel, though softened by hope, was still a constant enemy. He needed food, a fire, a safer shelter. His eyes scanned the chapel's interior, now illuminated by the ethereal light of the fountain. Shadows danced, revealing more details of the desolation: overturned pews, statues of saints with disfigured faces, and an altar covered by a shroud of dust and cobwebs. In a more distant corner, almost hidden by a fallen confessional, Ilara noticed a small, dark wooden door, almost swallowed by the wall. It looked ancient, perhaps older than the visible chapel itself. With Leo asleep and safe for a brief moment, the grandfather dragged himself over. The wood was swollen and rotten, but the iron doorknob, though rusted, was still attached. He pulled, and the door creaked with a groan that echoed through the nave. What lay behind was not a room, but a dark, narrow passage, spiraling down into the depths of the earth. The air that came from it was damp and heavy, with a smell of mold and ancient earth. It was the kind of place legends described as catacombs or secret crypts, where the deepest secrets were kept. The premise of a buried chapel echoed in Ilara's mind. Perhaps this was the true chapel, the hidden part, the guardian of the elixir. A shiver ran down the grandfather's spine. That place was dangerous, but curiosity and necessity were stronger than fear. If there was a secret, perhaps there was also a means to protect it, or even a supply of food or firewood. He couldn't leave Leo alone for long, but the darkness below promised answers, or perhaps more dangers. With one last look at Leo and the fountain that shone like a beacon of hope and misfortune, Ilara picked up a broken piece of wood, lit it with a spark from his flint, and with his heart pounding in his chest, began to descend the damp, uneven steps. Each step was an echo in the darkness, each shadow a possible enemy. The chapel, which had once seemed a refuge, now revealed itself as a labyrinth of mysteries and threats. The wine of angels had cured his grandson, but it had also chained them to an uncertain destiny where life and death, wealth and ruin danced in a dangerous ballet under the watchful eye of the relentless blizzard. The secret of the fountain was a heavy burden, and Ilara knew that the real battle was just beginning. He needed to find a way to hide the treasure, to protect Leo, before the world's greed found them. And time was running out. The trembling flame of the piece of wood Ilara held was a heart beating in the darkness, each pulse casting dancing shadows that twisted and stretched on the damp walls of the spiral passage. The air was heavy, with a smell of wet earth and something older, almost metallic, that made the hairs on his neck stand on end. Each uneven step was a challenge for his already exhausted muscles, and the sound of his own footsteps echoed, amplified, as if the underground chapel itself were watching him, breathing along with him. The descent seemed endless, the light from the fountain far above diminished with each turn, swallowed by the darkness that grew denser and more oppressive. Ilara felt the damp cold penetrate his thin clothes, but the image of Leo, cured yet still hungry and vulnerable, was a fire stronger than any frost. He needed to find something, anything. The walls of the passage, which at first seemed merely rough stone, began to reveal details. Engraved symbols, almost erased by time and dampness, appeared and disappeared in the flickering light. They were strange geometric shapes, intertwined with figures that looked like birds with outstretched wings, or perhaps angels, but in a way Ilara had never seen in any church. There was a solemnity, an aura of mystery that enveloped him, suggesting that this place was much more than a simple crypt. It was a sanctuary, a repository of forgotten secrets. The passage opened into a chamber. It wasn't large, but it was different from anything Ilara expected. The ceiling was vaulted, and in the center, a dark stone altar, covered by a cloth that had once been white, now faded and tattered. Around it, niches carved into the walls contained small ceramic vials and rolled parchments, all covered by a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. But what most caught his attention was a corner of the chamber, where a pile of dry, neatly stacked wood rose, protected from dampness by an old leather awning, and beside it a small wooden chest with rusted fittings. A wave of relief followed by a new wave of tension swept over Ilara. Firewood, a fire! The hope of warming Leo propelled him. He approached the pile of wood, touching it. It was dry, miraculously preserved. It was enough for several days, perhaps weeks, of warmth. But what about food? With trembling hands, Ilara knelt before the chest. The latch was stuck, but with a strong push the wood creaked and yielded. What he found inside was not gold or jewels, but something far more valuable at that moment. Dry, hard bread, wrapped in linen cloths, aged cheese, and a small leather canteen that, when shaken, revealed it contained liquid. Cautiously, he smelled it. It was water, fresh and clean, surprisingly. Someone, in some distant time, had prepared that refuge, leaving provisions for an uncertain future. But the chamber held more secrets. Ilara lit another piece of wood from the first flame, creating a stronger light. He turned to the niches. Carefully, he picked up one of the parchments. The writing was ancient, in a language he didn't fully understand, but some words, symbols, and illustrations were intelligible. There were drawings of sick people with the same sores that the Black Death caused, and then a golden liquid being poured, and people healing. And, repeatedly, the symbol of the winged bird, the same as on the passage walls. One of the ceramic vials, different from the others, seemed to have been opened recently. A sweet, familiar scent emanated from it. Ilara brought it to his nose. It was the same intoxicating aroma of the wine of angels. Someone had been here, someone new. The revelation chilled his blood. The chapel was not as abandoned as it seemed. Or perhaps the elixir had been used before, and the secret, guarded for generations, was about to be rediscovered. The tension mounted. The relief of finding food and firewood was quickly replaced by a growing fear. If someone else knew about the wine of angels, or had been here recently, who were they? And what would they do if they discovered Ilara and Leo had released the flow? Lord Valerius, with his insatiable greed, was just one of many dangers the elixir's wealth could attract. Ilara needed to act fast. He gathered some bread, a piece of cheese, and the canteen of water. The firewood would be more difficult. He couldn't carry much at once. But the most urgent matter was Leo. He was alone upstairs, near the fountain that glowed like a beacon of danger. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ilara began to ascend the spiral passage, the light of his makeshift torch dancing before him. Each step was faster now, driven by urgency. The underground chapel had offered salvation, but it had also revealed a disturbing truth. They were not alone in the quest for that miracle. The wine of angels was a blessing, but its discovery was a door open to a world of greed and danger. Ilara knew he needed to protect Leo and the secret of the fountain at all costs. The real battle, he realized, was not against the blizzard or disease, but against human nature. And that battle was just beginning. The descent had seemed endless, but the ascent was a race against time. The image of Leo, asleep and vulnerable, alone in the main nave, was a whip in his mind. And now, the new and disturbing revelation, the chapel was not as abandoned as it seemed. Someone had been there, perhaps recently, and knew about the wine of angels. That sweet, familiar scent from the open vial in the secret chamber lingered. Who, and what would they do if they discovered Ilara and Leo had released the flow? Lord Valerius, with his insatiable greed, was just one of many dangers the elixir's wealth could attract. With his heart pounding in his chest, Ilara quickened his pace. his arms aching from the weight of the bread, cheese, and water canteen. The firewood he would have to fetch later. The most urgent matter was Leo. The light from the fountain far above began to seep into the darkness of the passage, a golden beacon that, before, represented hope, but now an imminent danger. With a last effort, Ilara emerged into the main nave. His eyes swept the space, searching for Leo. He was there, exactly where he had left him, huddled under the cloak, still asleep. A sigh of relief escaped his lips, but it was quickly replaced by a new wave of urgency. The cold in the chapel seemed to have intensified while he was away, and the blizzard outside continued to howl, relentless. He knelt beside Leo, touching his forehead. The fever had drastically subsided, but his skin was still cold to the touch. He needed warmth, fast. Ilara stood up, his eyes scanning the nave. Where to build the fire? It couldn't be near the fountain. The heat could damage the elixir, or worse, attract unwanted attention if smoke escaped. He spotted a more sheltered corner, near the fallen confessional, where the walls seemed sturdier. With considerable effort, he dragged some of the overturned pews and loose pieces of wood to create a small barrier, a makeshift shelter for the fire. He returned to the secret passage, leaving Leo for just a moment. The descent and ascent were faster now, driven by necessity. He made several trips, bringing armfuls of dry firewood from the underground chamber. Each trip was a reminder of the secrets that place held and the dangers that could come with them. With a respectable pile of firewood and kindling, Ilara lit the fire. The spark from the flint quickly caught on the dry wood, and a small flame danced, growing with each careful breath from Ilara. Soon, a cheerful fire crackled in the corner of the chapel, casting lights and shadows that danced to its warmth. The smell of smoke and burning wood filled the air, a welcome contrast to the mold and dampness. The warmth began to spread, driving away the biting cold. Ilara dragged Leo closer to the fire, wrapping him more tightly in the cloak. The boy grumbled, slowly opening his eyes. His eyes, previously glazed by fever, now held a clearer sparkle. "Grandfather, I'm hungry," Leo whispered, his voice weak but audible. A tear of relief streamed down Ilara's face. "I know, my love. I brought food." He took a piece of the dry bread and a piece of cheese, offering them to Leo. The boy ate slowly, chewing with difficulty, but with a determination that filled Ilara's heart with hope. He also gave him the water from the canteen, which Leo drank avidly. With each sip, each bite, life seemed to return to his eyes. As Leo ate and the warmth of the fire enveloped them, Ilara felt a brief moment of peace. The blizzard still howled outside, but inside the chapel, the fire crackled, the golden fountain flowed softly, and Leo was recovering. But peace was fragile, and Ilara's mind could not rest. He picked up the parchment he had brought from the secret chamber. In the flickering firelight, the symbols and drawings seemed even more enigmatic. The figures of winged birds, the angels, were omnipresent, intertwined with scenes of healing and devotion. There were also drawings of people hiding vials, burying them, and a recurring image of a shadowy figure with hungry eyes lurking in the shadows. It was a warning, he realized. A story told through images about the power of the elixir and the danger it attracted. The open ceramic vial, the scent of the wine of angels, the pile of dry firewood, the provisions. Everything indicated that this place was a planned refuge, a sanctuary for times of despair, but also a location known to others. Who were the guardians or the thieves? The idea that someone else might be on their way or already knew about the fountain was an overwhelming weight. Ilara looked at the fountain, at the constant, gentle flow of the golden wine. It was a blessing, yes, but also a disguised curse. How to protect it? How to protect Leo? The blizzard outside continued to howl, a white curtain that, for now, isolated them from danger. But isolation was a double-edged sword. It also prevented them from seeking help or fleeing. The warmth of the fire, the food in Leo's stomach, the miraculous cure. All of it was a gift. But it came with a price. Ilara knew that the real battle was just beginning. Lord Valerius was just the first of the wolves who would smell that treasure. He needed to find a way to hide the treasure, to protect Leo before the world's greed found them. And time was running out. The chapel, which had once seemed a refuge, now revealed itself as a labyrinth of mysteries and threats. And Ilara, the simple widower, was the sole guardian of a secret that could change the world or destroy it. The warmth of the fire, a fleeting embrace against the chapel's relentless cold, was a balm for Ilara's exhausted body, but not for his mind. Leo, nestled beside him, chewed the bread with a slowness that was both a sign of weakness and a miraculous recovery. Each bite, each sip of fresh water, was a thread of life weaving back into his small body. His eyes, once opaque, now reflected the dancing flames and the fever. The silent assassin seemed to have retreated, leaving behind only weariness. But peace was a fragile illusion, a thin veil barely hiding the brewing storm. The parchment Ilara held, its rough yellowed edges, was a map to a treasure and a warning of danger. In the flickering firelight, the drawings came alive. Sick figures, open sores, agony stamped on ancient faces. And then, the transformation. The golden liquid poured, instantaneous healing, joy reborn. The symbol of the winged bird, the angel, repeated itself, a silent guardian, or perhaps a herald. But there was more. Ilara traced with his finger a series of images that chilled him. People hiding the vials, burying them in secret locations, camouflaging the fountain, and always lurking in the shadows, a shadowy figure with hungry eyes, a predator lying in wait. It was not a monster of legends, but the purest representation of human greed. It was a warning, clear as crystal. The wine of angels was a blessing, but its discovery was a door open to a curse. The open ceramic vial in the secret chamber, the sweet, familiar scent of the elixir still permeating the air, the pile of dry firewood, the carefully stored provisions. Everything screamed that this place was not a forgotten refuge, but a planned sanctuary known to others. Who were they? Guardians, or thieves who had discovered the secret and exploited it in silence? The idea that someone else might be on their way or already knew about the fountain was an overwhelming weight on Ilara's chest. He looked at the fountain, at the constant, gentle flow of the golden wine. It shone with a light of its own, a beacon of hope, and at the same time, a beacon of danger. How to protect it? How to protect Leo? The blizzard outside continued to howl, a white curtain that for now isolated them from the world. But isolation was a double-edged sword. It also prevented them from seeking help or fleeing. "Grandfather, what is that?" Leo whispered, pointing at the parchment. His eyes, now clearer, were fixed on the shadowy figure. Ilara clutched the parchment, feeling the dry, fragile paper beneath his fingers. "It's a story, my love, about a treasure and about people who wanted to steal it." He simplified, trying to protect his grandson's innocence. But the truth was that the story was much more complex and dangerous. He needed a plan. Lord Valerius was just the first of the wolves who would smell that treasure. If the elixir cured the Black Death, its value was incalculable, capable of moving armies, of toppling kingdoms. The chapel, which had once seemed a refuge, now revealed itself as a labyrinth of mysteries and threats. Ilara stood up, his mind buzzing. He needed to inspect the fountain more closely, understand how the flow had been released, and more importantly, how it could be hidden again. If the secret had been guarded for centuries, there should be a mechanism, a way to conceal the fountain from curious eyes. With Leo asleep again, lulled by the warmth of the fire and satiety, Ilara approached the fountain. The golden wine gushed from an opening in the rock, filling the stone basin with an ethereal glow. He touched the water, feeling its smooth viscosity and subtle warmth. The rock around the fountain was smooth, worn by time and water, but Ilara noticed something. Small, almost imperceptible grooves formed a pattern, a star map or perhaps a sequence of symbols. He ran his fingers over the grooves, feeling the texture. They weren't just decorations. They were part of something larger. He remembered the symbols on the passage walls, the winged birds, the same grooves that seemed to align with constellations. Could it be a mechanism, a key? As he examined the fountain, a subtle, almost inaudible sound broke the chapel's silence. It wasn't the wind's howl, nor the crackling of the fire. It was a more distant sound, a dragging, a creaking. Ilara froze, his heart pounding against his ribs. He turned sharply, his eyes sweeping the darkness of the main nave. Nothing, only dancing shadows. Was it his imagination, tired and overwhelmed, or was the parchment's warning becoming reality? The shadowy figure, the hungry eyes. The chapel was not as abandoned as it seemed, and time was running out. The blizzard, which had once been a blessing, now seemed a trap, keeping them confined with a danger that approached step by step in the darkness. Ilara clenched his fists. He was a simple widower, but he would not allow anything to happen to Leo, nor would he let the treasure that had saved them fall into the wrong hands. The battle was just beginning, and he was ready to fight. The subtle, almost inaudible sound reverberated again, this time clearer, closer. It wasn't the wind howling outside, nor the friendly crackling of the fire. It was a heavy dragging, a metallic creak that seemed to come from the depths of the chapel, as if the ancient stones themselves were moving, or something was being dragged over them. Ilara froze, his heart pounding against his ribs, a drum of fear and adrenaline. His eyes swept the darkness of the main nave, where shadows danced, elongated and distorted by the fire. Nothing. Only the illusion of movement, his exhausted mind playing tricks, but instinct, sharpened by years of deprivation and danger, screamed that this was no imagination. The shadowy figure from the parchment, with its hungry eyes, materialized in his mind, a chilling premonition. The chapel, which had just seemed a sanctuary, now transformed into a trap, a stage for an unknown drama. Ilara instinctively crouched, shielding Leo with his own body, though the boy was deeply asleep, oblivious to the imminent danger. The warmth of the fire, once a comfort, now seemed a beacon, an invitation to anyone outside, or worse still, inside. He forced himself to breathe, to calm the tremor in his hands. He needed to think, not react blindly. The sound. Where was it coming from? It seemed to come from below, from the floor, or perhaps from that secret passage he had used for firewood. The idea that someone else might have discovered the passage, or that there was another entrance, sent a shiver down his spine. If it was Lord Valerius, he wouldn't come alone. And if it wasn't him, who would it be? The thieves, the predators, the parchment spoke of? Ilara looked at the fountain, at the constant flow of the wine of angels. The golden liquid shone, an invaluable treasure that now seemed too heavy a burden for his shoulders. How to hide it? How to protect Leo and himself from an invisible threat? He remembered the grooves in the rock around the fountain, the patterns that seemed to align with constellations or with the symbols on the parchment. Could it be a concealment mechanism, a key? With renewed determination, Ilara approached the fountain again, ignoring the fear that still gnawed at him. He ran his fingers over the grooves, feeling the cold, worn texture. There was a small, almost imperceptible protrusion that seemed to fit perfectly into the hollow of his thumb. He pressed, turned, fumbled. Nothing. The wine continued to gush, Indifferent to his despair, the metallic creak repeated itself, louder this time, accompanied by a muffled thud, as if something heavy had fallen or been dragged with force. It was unmistakable. Someone was there, and they were approaching. Ilara needed a distraction, time. If he couldn't hide the fountain, he needed to hide Leo. And if the secret passage was the entry route, perhaps it was also the escape route. But to where? The blizzard outside was merciless, a certain death. His eyes fell upon the pile of dry firewood. It wasn't much, but it was something. He picked up the thinnest twigs, his mind working feverishly. If the threat was coming from the passage, perhaps he could delay them. He remembered an old story his grandfather used to tell about simple but effective traps. With the agility of someone fighting for survival, Ilara began to stack twigs and pieces of dry wood near the entrance of the secret passage, creating a makeshift barrier. It wouldn't stop anyone, but it would make noise, alerting him. He also took the empty ceramic vial, which had once contained the elixir, and placed it precariously on top of the pile, hoping it would fall and make a resounding crash. As he worked, his ears were alert to every whisper of the wind, every crack of the wood. The air in the chapel seemed to have grown denser, laden with a somber expectation. The smell of mold and dampness now mingled with a strange, faint but perceptible odor, wet earth and something metallic, like dried blood. Leo grumbled again, and Ilara turned to him. His eyes were open, fixed on him, the fever seeming to have returned in a flash of fear. "Grandfather." "What is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling, pointing into the darkness. Ilara hugged him tightly, feeling the fragile warmth of his body. "It's nothing, my love. Just the wind. Go back to sleep." But he knew he was lying. The boy, even in his weak state, felt the tension in the air. He needed more time. His eyes fixed on the parchment again, on the images of angels, of hidden vials. There was a recurring image of a symbol, a kind of seal, that appeared at various points, including at the base of the fountain, almost imperceptible beneath the flow of the wine. It was a circle with 3 dots, like a crown. He remembered seeing something similar on the walls of the secret chamber, carved into the stone. With a sudden flash of inspiration, Ilara picked up one of the burnt twigs from the fire and, with the charred tip, began to draw the symbol on the damp earth beside the fountain. He traced the circle, the 3 dots, trying to replicate the precision of the ancients. It was a desperate attempt, a shot in the dark, but the story on the parchment spoke of guardians, of rituals. Perhaps it wasn't a mechanical mechanism, but something that required knowledge, a code. As he drew, the sound intensified. It was no longer a distant dragging, but footsteps, heavy, shuffling, coming from the direction of the secret passage. The ceramic vial on the pile of firewood swayed precariously. Ilara stood up abruptly, pulling Leo closer to the fire, to the protection of the denser shadows. His eyes were fixed on the entrance of the passage. He could feel the presence, the heavy breathing, the smell of sweat and earth. The blizzard outside continued to howl, an icy symphony that masked the danger now inside the chapel. The battle was not just beginning, it had arrived. And Ilara, the simple widower, was about to face not only the world's greed, but also the darkest secrets that buried chapel held. The metallic creak repeated itself, this time accompanied by the sound of wood cracking, and then a heavy silence foreshadowing the revelation. The ceramic vial fell with a dull thud, but the sound was muffled by something much larger. A deep, guttural moan that echoed through the chapel walls, coming directly from the darkness of the passage. It was not the sound of a man, it was the sound of a creature. The deep, guttural moan tore through the air, not like a lament, but like a warning, a contained roar that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. It was not the sound of a man, nor of a wild animal one might find in the frozen forests. It was the sound of a creature, something ancient and distorted, echoing in the damp stones of the chapel, making Ilara feel the cold not just of the blizzard, but of a primordial terror that seeped into his bones. His arms squeezed Leo with desperate force, pulling the boy back into the densest shadow behind the fountain, where the golden glow of the wine of angels now seemed a dangerous beacon. Leo's eyes, wide and feverish, reflected the same dread that consumed him. He didn't need to understand to feel the imminent danger. A heavy silence followed the moan, a silence that was even more terrifying than the sound. Ilara could hear his own ragged breath, the frantic beat of his heart. Every fiber of his being screamed to flee, but to where? The blizzard outside was a white wall of death, and the secret passage, the only apparent escape route, was where the threat was coming from. Then, from the darkness of the passage, a silhouette emerged. It wasn't tall, but it was massive, hunched and moved with a dragging slowness, as if each step was a monumental effort. The metallic creak Ilara had heard before became visible. Heavy, rusted chains hung from what appeared to be the creature's arms and legs, dragging across the stone floor with a scraping sound that chilled Ilara to the soul. The flickering firelight danced over the figure, revealing details that made Ilara's blood run cold. It wasn't a monster of legends, not exactly. It was human, or had once been. Its skin was a sickly grey, covered in open wounds and dark scabs, as if corroded by a terrible disease or years of neglect in a damp dungeon. Its limbs were disproportionately long and thin, but its shoulders were broad and hunched, giving it a grotesque appearance. Its head, almost necklace, hung to one side, and where eyes should have been there were only two dark, empty sockets, as if they had been torn out. But Ilara swore he felt a gaze, a malevolent presence that pierced him. The smell the creature carried with it was nauseating, a mixture of mold, wet earth, and a metallic, sickly, sweet odor of ancient blood and decaying flesh. It was the smell of death, of rot that refused to lie down. The creature stopped at the entrance of the passage, as if sniffing the air. Its head moved slowly, from side to side, and then, with agonizing slowness, turned in the direction of the fountain. The wine of angels, gushing and glowing, seemed to draw it like a moth to a flame. A new moan, lower, more sibilant, escaped its throat, and Ilara realized it was not a sound of pain, but of recognition, perhaps even longing. The creature began to move again, dragging its chains, its steps heavy and uneven. Each movement was a visual torture, a macabre dance of bones and decaying flesh. Ilara retreated further, wrapping Leo in his arms, desperately trying to merge with the shadows. He had no weapons, nowhere to go. The only thing he could do was protect the boy. His eyes darted to the symbol he had drawn on the damp earth beside the fountain, the circle with the 3 dots. It was a vain hope, a remnant of an ancient superstition, but it was all he had. With a trembling hand, he grabbed a charred twig from the fire and with the other tried to redraw the symbol, with more precision, with more intention. Perhaps it was a seal, a barrier, something the ancient guardians used. The creature was a few feet from the fountain now, the golden light of the elixir reflecting on its grey skin and rusted chains. It extended a long, twisted arm, its skeletal fingers approaching the stone basin. Ilara felt a shiver of horror. If the creature drank the wine, what would happen? Would it be cured, or would it be further strengthened, transformed into something even more terrible? With a silent cry of despair, Ilara pushed Leo behind the fountain into a dark niche in the wall and threw himself forward, placing himself between the creature and the elixir. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse with fear but charged with a protective fury. The creature stopped, its hand hovering over the golden water. Its head tilted to the side, as if listening, and then, to Ilara's horror, a guttural sound, almost a dry, airless laugh, escaped its throat. There were no eyes, but Ilara felt he was being watched, assessed. The creature raised its arm, not towards the fountain, but towards the wall behind it, towards the grooves Ilara had noticed. Its skeletal fingers, long and thin, began to trace the marks, as if reading an invisible map. Ilara watched, paralyzed, as the creature followed the pattern, tracing the grooves with terrifying precision. This was no irrational animal. There was a dark intelligence there, a knowledge of the chapel's secrets. When the creature's fingers reached the spot where Ilara had felt the protrusion, the creature pressed. A soft click, almost inaudible, echoed through the chapel, and then, to Ilara's astonishment and horror, the flow of the wine of angels began to diminish, to dwindle, until the golden water stopped completely, leaving the stone basin empty and dry. The creature had closed the fountain. A new moan escaped its throat, this time with a tone of macabre satisfaction. Ilara felt an even greater chill. The creature didn't want the elixir for itself. It wanted to hide it, or worse, it wanted to keep it away from Ilara. The creature turned again to Ilara, and even without eyes, the widower felt the weight of its presence. The chains dragged as the creature took a step forward, then another. There was no longer the glow of the wine to distract it. Ilara and Leo were exposed, and the creature seemed to have a new objective. The air in the chapel grew even denser, laden with an imminent threat. The blizzard outside continued to howl, but the real danger was now a few steps from Ilara, a nightmare creature that seemed to be the dark guardian of a secret Ilara was only beginning to comprehend. The battle was not just for survival, but for the very soul of that place, and Ilara felt he was about to discover the true extent of the horror the buried chapel held. The creature took another step, its chains dragging like an iron shroud. There was no haste in its movements, only a cold inevitability that chilled the blood in Ilara's veins. He had nowhere to go. The niche behind the fountain was a dead end, and the secret passage was where the horror had emerged. His eyes swept the floor, desperately searching for something, anything, that could serve as a weapon, but there were only cold stones and damp earth. The parchment, crumpled and wet, was still in his hands, a fragile shield against the advancing terror. The creature stopped a few feet from Ilara, its head tilted to the side, as if sniffing the air. Or perhaps as if reading the fear emanating from him. Its skeletal fingers, still damp from the fountain's sludge, pointed to the ground, to the symbol Ilara had traced, the circle with the 3 dots. A low moan, almost a hiss, escaped its throat, but this time it seemed to carry a different tone, not of threat, but of recognition. Ilara, his heart pounding, looked at the symbol on the earth, then at the parchment in his hands. The same circle, the same 3 dots. The story spoke of guardians, of rituals. Perhaps the creature was one of these guardians, corrupted, but still bound by the ancient codes. The creature slowly knelt, an agonizing creak of chains and bones. Its long, thin fingers with brittle, dirty nails began to trace the symbol on the earth, not what Ilara had drawn, but slightly to the side, with a precision Ilara hadn't been able to replicate. It was the same symbol, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible detail. A small notch at the base of the circle, like a key. Ilara, holding his breath, compared the creature's new tracing with the images on the parchment. And there it was, almost invisible, hidden among the folds of the ancient paper, a small notch, exactly as the creature had drawn. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a key. A key to what? To the fountain? To the creature? Or to something deeper? The creature raised its hand again, pointing to the wall where it had closed the fountain. Not to the exact spot, but to a series of grooves and notches Ilara had barely noticed before, hidden in the darkness. It was a pattern, a sequence of smaller symbols, almost indecipherable at first glance. A new moan, this time softer, almost a macabre invitation, escaped the creature's throat. It retreated a step, then another, gesturing with its skeletal hand for Ilara to approach the wall. Fear was still paralyzing, but curiosity and the desperate hope of saving Leo began to overcome the terror. If the creature was trying to communicate, if there was a chance to reactivate the fountain, Ilara had to risk it. With Leo trembling in his arms, Ilara took a hesitant step towards the wall, keeping his eyes fixed on the creature. He could smell the nauseating odor, the icy presence, but the creature made no hostile movement. It merely watched, its head tilted to the side, like a walking enigma. As he approached, the grooves in the stone became clearer. They weren't random, they were symbols, small and intricate, repeating in a sequence. Ilara looked at the parchment, searching for correspondences. The story of the guardians, the rituals, the secrets. Everything was there, coded in the images and ancient texts. The parchment spoke of the guardian's seal, a set of gestures and intentions that activated and deactivated the chapel's powers. The symbol the creature had drawn, and that Ilara now saw on the parchment with the small notch, was the key of will. And the sequence on the wall? It was the Song of Water, a melody of symbols that needed to be played in the correct order to awaken the elixir's flow. Ilara's mind reeled. The creature was not an enemy, not entirely. It was a guardian, yes, but a guardian who had been imprisoned, perhaps, or who had lost its sanity over the centuries. And now, for some reason, it was trying to guide him. But why? And what would happen if he failed? With trembling hands, Ilara began to trace the symbols on the wall, following the pattern the parchment revealed. The first symbol was an ascending spiral, the second, a falling tear, the third, the circle with the 3 dots, but with the secret notch. Each touch was an act of faith, a challenge to the fear that still enveloped him. The creature watched, motionless, its presence a heavy, silent shadow. When Ilara touched the last symbol, the secret notch of the circle, a low hum began to vibrate through the chapel walls. It wasn't the sound of chains, but a deep resonance, as if the stone itself was awakening. The creature took a step back, its shoulders hunched, and a stronger moan, this time with a tone of relief or perhaps ancient pain, escaped its throat. And then, with a soft gurgle, the fountain began to gush again. Not the torrential flow from before, but a constant golden stream of the wine of angels, filling the stone basin. The elixir's glow illuminated the chapel, casting a golden halo over the creature, which now seemed less threatening, more tragic. Ilara felt a mixture of relief and dread. The wine was back, but the creature was still there, and the truth about it was still a mystery. The creature slowly turned, not to Ilara, but to the secret passage from which it had come. Its dragging steps, the chains clinking, began to lead it back into the darkness. It seemed its task was complete, or perhaps that its presence there was only temporary. But before the creature completely disappeared into the darkness, it stopped. Its head tilted to the side, and a different sound, a sharp, persistent scratching, echoed from the passage. It wasn't the sound of the creature's chains. It was the sound of wood being forced, of metal scraping against stone. The sound came from beyond the secret passage, from a deeper, darker place. The creature let out a sibilant moan, this time laden with a contained fury, and turned abruptly, not towards the secret passage, but towards the chapel's main entrance. The wooden door Ilara had barricaded. The scratching intensified, and a new sound, that of muffled voices and cruel laughter, began to seep into the chapel. It wasn't the Lord alone. There were more people, and they were coming. The sharp, persistent scratching sound cut through the chapel's already heavy air like a cold blade. It wasn't the clinking of the creature's chains, nor the howl of the blizzard outside. It was something more organic, more violent, the unmistakable sound of wood being torn, of metal scraping against stone, coming from beyond the secret passage, from a deeper, unknown abyss. Ilara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the chapel's cold. The creature, previously almost a macabre guide, let out a sibilant moan. This time, there was no relief or ancient pain, but a contained, almost primal fury that reverberated through the damp walls. Its lightless eyes turned abruptly, not towards the darkness of the passage from which the new and disturbing sound came, but towards the chapel's main entrance, the wooden door Ilara had barricaded with useless desperation. The scratching intensified, now mingling with a new chorus of sounds, muffled voices, cruel laughter, and the unmistakable thud of a makeshift battering ram against the wood. It wasn't the Lord alone, Ilara understood with icy dread. There were more people, and they were coming. The chapel, which moments before had seemed a precarious refuge, transformed into a trap. Ilara pressed Leo against his chest. The boy's feverish warmth, the only comfort amidst the rising terror. The wine of angels flowed softly in the stone basin, a golden thread of hope, and now a beacon for the approaching greed. The creature, with its silent fury, stepped forward, positioning itself between Ilara and the main door. Its movements were slow but laden with a dark intent, like an ancestral guardian awakened to a new threat. The chains dragged, no longer like a lament, but like a warning. The pounding on the door grew stronger, more insistent. The wood groaned, cracked, and splinters began to fly. Ilara could hear the voices more clearly now, the Lord's guttural laugh mixed with the crude enthusiasm of other men. "It's here! I told you, you fools! The gold, the elixir, it's all here!" The sound of metal scraping from the secret passage, however, did not cease. It was a different sound, more metallic, more mechanical, as if something was being forced open or forced out. The creature let out another moan, this time a low growl that seemed to come from deep within its skeletal frame. Its long, thin fingers, previously used to manipulate symbols, now curled into claws, pointing at the door that was about to give way. It was a warning, a defense, or perhaps a challenge. Ilara didn't know. But the creature's presence, however terrifying, seemed to offer a barrier against the evil coming from outside. With a final crack and an agonizing groan, the wooden door shattered, flying into the chapel in an explosion of splinters. The faint light of the Lord's lantern, followed by the torches of his henchmen, invaded the sanctuary, revealing the scene. Ilara huddled with Leo, the wine of angels gushing in the basin, and the creature, skeletal and chained, in a guarding stance. The Lord, with his cruel smile and hungry eyes, stepped forward, followed by two stout men, armed with rusted axes. The cold air of the blizzard invaded the chapel, but the heat of greed was palpable. "Well, well, Ilara, you old wretch," he hissed, his eyes fixed on the golden glow of the elixir. "So you found the treasure after all, and thought to keep it for yourself?" His eyes swept the chapel, stopping at the creature. A flash of surprise, then contempt, crossed his face. "What is that? Some kind of old gargoyle? No matter. What matters is what's in that basin." He gestured to his men. "Get him! And the wine! Don't leave a single drop." But before the men could advance, the creature let out a cry that was neither human nor animal, but something that seemed to tear the very fabric of reality. It was a sound of pain and fury, of centuries of imprisonment and despair. The chains that bound it snapped, and the creature lunged forward, not attacking, but creating a barrier between Ilara and the invaders. Its skeletal fingers stretched out, and a faint, almost imperceptible glow emanated from its nails, as if darkness itself were condensing at their tips. The henchmen hesitated, fear replacing greed in their eyes. The Lord, however, was more audacious. "Don't be fools. It's just an old broken thing. Advance!" As the tension mounted at the entrance, the scratching sound coming from the secret passage grew louder, more frantic. It wasn't just a scratch, it was a tear, a break. And a new sound, a muffled but deep groan, began to echo from there, a sound that belonged to no creature known to Ilara. It was a sound of hunger, of something about to be unleashed. Ilara noticed the creature's gaze. It wasn't just defending the wine or itself. It was defending the chapel, and perhaps Ilara himself, from something far worse than the Lord and his men. The creature turned for an instant, its lightless eyes fixed on the secret passage, and a tremor ran through its skeletal body. Danger came not just from one direction, but from two, and what lay behind the secret passage seemed to be the oldest and most terrible threat of all. The Lord, impatient, pushed one of his men. "Go, or you won't see a single copper!" The men, reluctant, stepped forward, their axes raised. The creature let out another cry, a sound that seemed to tear the air, and the entire chapel trembled. Stones from the ceiling began to dislodge small fragments, and the golden thread of the wine of angels in the basin quivered, as if the very essence of the elixir was reacting to the imminent violence. Ilara knew that time had run out. The battle for Leo's life, and perhaps his own, was about to begin. And he was caught between the greed of men and the ancestral horror stirring in the depths of the chapel. The air in the chapel, already heavy with dampness and the smell of earth, grew dense with the promise of violence. Ilara pressed Leo against himself, the boy's body trembling, not just from fever, but now also from fear. The creature's cry, a sound that tore the ether, reverberated through the walls, causing stones from the ceiling to dislodge fragments. The golden thread of the wine of angels in the basin quivered, as if the very essence of the elixir reacted to the imminent discord, its glow flickering like a beating heart. The Lord, with impatient fury, pushed one of his men. "Go, or you won't see a single copper!" The henchman, reluctant, but driven by greed and fear of the Lord, stepped forward. Their rusted axes rose, the blades reflecting the flickering torchlight, ready for attack. The creature, however, did not retreat. Its movements were slow, but laden with an ancestral force. The chains that bound it snapped, no longer like a lament, but like a warning, a metallic roar. It did not attack directly, not with the ferocity of a wild beast, but with the precision of a guardian. With an abrupt movement, it extended one of its skeletal arms, and the chains previously attached to its body whipped through the air with surprising speed. They did not strike the men, but embedded themselves in the stone floor in front of them, creating a makeshift barrier, an invisible boundary they hesitated to cross. The faint glow emanating from its nails intensified for an instant, a condensed penumbra that seemed to suck the very light from the torches. The Lord's men stopped, their eyes wide with terror. It wasn't just an old, broken thing, as the Lord had said. It was something more, something that defied comprehension, a living, chained shadow. "What are you waiting for, you cowards?" the Lord growled, his voice full of contempt. "It's just an illusion. Advance." But fear was stronger than greed for those men. They looked at the creature, at the chains embedded in the floor, and at the subtle glow that still emanated from its claws. It was as if the very darkness of the chapel had taken form and stood in defense. As the tension solidified at the entrance, the sound coming from the secret passage became a palpable horror. It was no longer a scratch, nor a tear. It was a burst, a deep, cavernous groan, as if the very rock was being torn apart from within. The smell of damp earth and mold mingled with a new metallic and putrid odor that made Ilara gag. The creature, maintaining its defensive posture against the invaders, turned its skeletal head for an instant, its lightless eyes fixed on the secret passage. A tremor ran through its chained body, and a sibilant moan, this time of pure dread, escaped its throat. It was not the fear of a prisoner, but the terror of one who knows an ancient, unspeakable evil. The Lord, irritated by his men's hesitation, stepped forward, brandishing his lantern. "What's that noise now? Don't tell me there's more of your old sorcery, Alara." He tried to peer past the creature, but the skeletal figure blocked his view of the passage. Suddenly, the stone wall around the secret passage began to crack. These weren't superficial cracks, but deep fissures like black veins opening in the rock. A fist-sized piece of stone broke off and fell to the floor with a dull thud, revealing a glimpse of even deeper darkness, and what appeared to be an eye. A large, opaque, lidless eye that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The moan from within the passage became a growl, a bone-vibrating sound, a primordial hunger that did not belong to this world. The Lord's men, who had previously hesitated to advance, now recoiled in panic, their faces pale with terror. One of their axes clattered to the floor. "What? What is that?" one of them stammered, pointing at the passage. The Lord, for a moment, lost his arrogance. His eyes, previously fixed on the elixir's greed, now widened with genuine fear. He was not a man of courage, only of cruelty. What was emerging from the darkness was something even he could not comprehend or control. The creature, perceiving the new threat, let out a war cry, a sound that mixed fury and despair. It turned completely towards the secret passage, its chains stretched to their maximum, as if preparing to face an enemy it had known for ages. The glow of its nails intensified, and this time a faint, dark aura seemed to envelop its skeletal body, like a shield of shadows. Alara felt the ground tremble beneath his feet. Leo coughed weakly, his body shaking. He looked at the wine of angels, which continued to gush, a golden thread of life and hope amidst the chaos. The creature was defending the chapel, the elixir, and perhaps itself, from something far worse than the greed of men. But it was chained, and the approaching threat seemed to be of a magnitude that not even the creature could contain alone. With a final, deafening crack, the secret passage gave way. The wall crumbled in a cloud of dust and debris, revealing a cavernous opening. And from within, slowly crawling into the faint light of the chapel, emerged a shapeless form, a mass of shadows and twisted appendages, with multiple opaque eyes that gleamed with insatiable hunger. It was not a creature of flesh and blood, but something older, more elemental, made of darkness and despair. The smell of rot and rusted metal flooded the chapel. The Lord and his men screamed in unison, a cry of pure terror. Greed was instantly replaced by the instinct of survival. They were not prepared for this. They were not prepared for the horror the chapel had guarded for centuries. The chained creature let out a roar, a desperate challenge, and lunged forward, its chains stretching, its skeletal fingers ready to face the abomination. Alara, with Leo in his arms, realized that the battle for his grandson's life had transformed into something much larger. He was caught between the fury of a guardian, the greed of cowardly men, and the hunger of an ancestral creature that had just awakened. The wine of angels continued to flow, a golden beacon in a world that had suddenly become infinitely darker. The scream of the Lord and his men tore through the air, a chorus of pure terror that echoed through the chapel walls, muffling the sound of the blizzard outside. There was no more greed in their eyes, only visceral dread before the creature crawling from the darkness. The shapeless mass, made of shadows and twisted appendages with multiple opaque eyes that gleamed with insatiable hunger, was not something the human mind could easily process. It was the personification of nightmare, the ancestral horror the chapel had guarded for centuries, now unleashed. The smell of rot and rusted metal, previously subtle, flooded the chapel, mingling with mold and dampness, making the air almost unbreathable. The Lord himself, his face pale and eyes wide, stumbled backward, his lantern falling from his trembling hands and shattering on the floor, plunging the entrance into an even deeper gloom. The Lord's men, once so full of bravado, fell to their knees, some vomiting, others simply paralyzed by fear, their axes forgotten on the floor. The chained creature, the skeletal guardian, did not hesitate. Its roar, previously a desperate challenge, transformed into a war cry, a sound that seemed to tear the last strength from its fragile body. It lunged forward, its chains stretched to their maximum, creaking and clanking against the stone. The glow of its nails intensified, and the faint, dark aura that enveloped it seemed to solidify, transforming into a shield of shadows that shimmered with ancient energy. The abomination, in turn, did not seem to have a specific target. Its multiple opaque eyes swept the chapel, but seemed to fix on the golden thread of the wine of angels, which continued to gush into the basin, a beacon of life and light amidst the growing darkness. A deep growl, which seemed to come from within the earth itself, escaped its shapeless mass, and one of its twisted appendages, resembling a tentacle made of shadows and thorns, whipped through the air, striking one of the chapel's stone columns. The column shuddered, and a shower of debris fell from the ceiling, raising a cloud of dust that further obscured the view. Ilara pressed Leo against himself, shielding him with his own body. The boy coughed weakly, his body trembling with fever and fear, but his eyes, though cloudy, seemed fixed on the struggle unfolding. He did not comprehend the horror, but he felt the tension, the imminent threat. The Guardian, with surprising agility for its chained condition, intercepted the tentacle's attack. Its skeletal claws, wreathed in the dark aura, dug into the abomination's shadowy mass. There was no blood, no flesh, but a sibilant sound, as if darkness itself was being torn. The abomination recoiled for an instant, letting out a groan that made the chapel stones vibrate. But the Guardian was at a disadvantage. The chains bound it, limiting its movements, while the abomination seemed fluid, capable of contorting and expanding, its appendages multiplying and twisting like a tangle of nightmares. Another tentacle, thicker and covered in sharp protrusions, emerged from the shapeless mass and struck the Guardian in the chest. The impact was brutal, sending the Guardian's skeletal body crashing against the wall, and the chains snapped with a force that threatened to break them. A cry of pain, a sound that was not human but laden with a millennial anguish, escaped the Guardian. The dark aura around it wavered, and Ilara felt an icy shiver run down his spine. The Guardian was weakening. It was fighting with everything it had, but the abomination was relentless, a primordial force of nature that seemed to feed on fear and despair itself. The Lord's men, seeing the fight, began to crawl away, trying to drag themselves out of the chapel towards the illusory safety of the blizzard. The Lord, however, seemed to have a last flicker of his greed. His eyes, previously fixed on the horror, now turned to the basin of the wine of angels. He saw opportunity in the chaos, a chance to steal the elixir while the two creatures destroyed each other. With a grunt, he rose, stumbling, and began to crawl towards the fountain, ignoring the terrified pleas of his men. The wine is ours," he muttered, his voice hoarse with fear and obsession. Ilara saw the Lord's movement. He was caught between the Guardian fighting desperately to protect the chapel and the elixir, and the Lord who, in his blindness, was about to pounce on Leo's only hope. The golden thread of the wine of angels shone, almost inviting, amidst the darkness and violence. The abomination, as if sensing the Lord's intention, or perhaps drawn by the elixir's glow, diverted its attention from the Guardian for an instant. One of its tentacles, thinner and faster than the others, whipped towards the basin, aiming for the golden flow. The Guardian, perceiving the imminent danger to the elixir, let out a roar of fury and despair. With a monumental effort, it pushed itself off the wall, its chains stretching, and launched itself in front of the tentacle, intercepting it once more. But this time, the impact was too much. One of the chains that bound it to the ground snapped, and a sound of twisted metal echoed through the chapel. The guardian fell to its knees, the dark aura around it dangerously diminishing. The abomination, with a growl of triumph, advanced, its multiple eyes fixed on the weakened guardian, and beyond it, on the golden glow of the wine. The Lord, seeing his chance, was a few steps from the basin, his hands outstretched, his face contorted in a mask of greed and madness. The air in the chapel seemed to vibrate with tension, the sound of grinding metal, the growls of the abomination, and the moans of the dying guardian created a symphony of despair. Ilara felt the ground tremble, the smell of rot and fear suffocating him. But amidst it all, the golden glow of the wine of angels was a beacon, a promise. He squeezed Leo tighter, the warmth of his small, feverish body, the only thing keeping him sane. The idea in his mind was not logical, but instinctive, a desperate gamble against the overwhelming forces surrounding him. The Lord, with a cry of triumph distorted by madness, reached out his hands to the basin, his fingers almost touching the golden liquid. But before he could reach it, Ilara, driven by a strength he didn't know he possessed, leaped. He was not a man of physical strength, but the protective instinct within him was a lion. With a swift and unexpected movement, he threw himself forward, his lean body and Leo's weight in his arms, colliding with the Lord. The Lord, unbalanced and weak with fear, fell to the side with a thud, his hands clawing at empty air. At the same instant, the abomination's thinnest tentacle, which had veered towards the basin, whipped out. Ilara felt the air move beside him, the creature's putrid stench invading his nostrils. He crouched, shielding Leo, and extended his free hand, not to drink, but to scoop. His fingers plunged into the wine of angels, and a wave of warmth and energy surged through his arm. He did not hesitate. With a cry that mixed fury and hope, Ilara flung the golden liquid. It was not a precise throw, but an act of desperation. The wine of angels flew through the air, not towards the abomination, but onto the skeletal guardian, who lay fallen, its chains clanking, its dark aura almost extinguished. The golden elixir struck the guardian's body, and the effect was immediate and spectacular. A dazzling light erupted from the guardian, not the faint glow from before, but an explosion of golden energy that filled the chapel. The sound of chains twisting and clanking intensified, but this time it was not a sound of breaking, but of strengthening. The dark aura around the guardian not only returned, but expanded, mingling with the golden light of the elixir, creating a shimmering shield of shadows and hope. The guardian, previously on the verge of defeat, let out a renewed roar, a sound that now carried not only fury, but an ancestral power that seemed to awaken from a deep slumber. It rose. Its chains, though still bound, seemed stronger, more resilient. Its eyes, once mere points of light, now burned with fierce intensity. The abomination, caught by surprise by the explosion of light and energy, recoiled with a sharp screech, a sound that seemed to tear the fabric of reality. Its multiple opaque eyes contracted, and the tentacles that stretched towards the fountain hastily retracted, as if they had been burned. The smell of rot intensified, but now mixed with an odor of something burning, something that was neither flesh nor wood, but darkness. The Lord, fallen on the ground, watched the scene with wide eyes, his greed momentarily forgotten before the display of power. His men, who were crawling towards the exit, stopped, turning to witness the spectacle. Ilara, with Leo still in his arms, felt the warmth of the wine of angels on his skin, a vibrant energy that seemed to calm his grandson's trembling. He had made his choice, and the result was undeniable. The guardian, now imbued with the elixir's power, was no longer a creature on the verge of death, but a revitalized warrior, a beacon of resistance against the darkness. The battle was not over, but the balance had shifted. Hope, Previously a faint thread, now shone with a golden intensity in the heart of the buried chapel. The chapel, once a tomb of stone and darkness, transformed into a battlefield illuminated by golden hope. The guardian, now bathed in the wine of angels, was no longer the skeletal figure on the verge of collapse. It was a beacon, a fortress of light and shadow. Its eyes, previously mere points of light, burned with an ancestral fury, and the dark aura that enveloped it pulsed with renewed energy, mingling with the golden glow of the elixir. The chains, which once bound it, now seemed like conduits for this new force, stretching with a resistance that defied logic. With a roar that made the chapel stones tremble to their foundations, the guardian lunged. There was no longer the hesitation of weakness, only the determination of an awakened protector. Its movements were fluid, despite the chains that still bound it to the ground. It became a blur of darkness and gold, its skeletal claws, now wreathed in golden flames, attacking the shapeless mass of the abomination. The creature, which had previously seemed invulnerable, recoiled with a shriek of pain. Where the guardian's claws touched, the abomination's darkness not only tore, but seemed to burn, releasing a putrid, acrid odor that choked the air. Its multiple opaque eyes widened in a mixture of surprise and something resembling panic. The tentacles, which had previously whipped with impunity, now writhed in agony, trying to dodge the guardian's incandescent blows. Ilara, with Leo still nestled in his arms, felt the change in the atmosphere. The terror had not disappeared, but a new emotion, a vibrant thread of hope, coursed through his body. He hugged his grandson, and to his surprise, felt the feverish heat in his small body diminish. Leo, who had previously trembled and coughed weakly, now breathed more easily. His eyes, though still cloudy, seemed to follow the deadly dance unfolding before him with less frightened curiosity. The wine of angels not only healed, but also instilled courage, or perhaps dissipated the veil of fear that illness had cast upon him. The abomination, in its fury and pain, began to expand, its tentacles multiplying in a defensive frenzy. It tried to envelop the guardian, to suffocate it in its mass of shadows and thorns. But the guardian, with the elixir's new strength, was unstoppable. It spun, its chains stretching to their maximum, and with a powerful blow, tore one of the creature's thickest tentacles. There was no blood, but a jet of dense, foul darkness gushed out, and the abomination let out a shriek that made Ilara's ears ring. The guardian, perceiving the creature's vulnerability, concentrated its energy. The dark aura around it intensified, mingling further with the golden glow of the elixir, and it unleashed a shockwave. It was not a physical attack, but an explosion of energy that seemed to repel darkness itself. The abomination was thrown backward, colliding with the opposite wall of the chapel with a wet, nauseating thud. Deep cracks formed in the stone, and more debris fell from the ceiling. But this time, the rising dust seemed to carry a smell of something purified, something broken. The Lord, seeing the abomination weaken, and perhaps feeling a flicker of his old arrogance, began to rise again. His eyes, still fixed on the basin of the wine of angels, gleamed with renewed madness. The wine is mine," he stammered, his voice hoarse and trembling. He ignored the danger, the battle still unfolding, and began to crawl again towards the fountain, like a moth drawn to a flame, blind to the fact that the flame could consume him. Ilara saw the Lord's movement. The battle with the abomination was not yet over, but the man's threat in his blind greed was immediate and dangerous. He could not allow him to steal Leo's only hope, the source of healing that had reinvigorated the guardian. The wine of angels was the key to his grandson's survival, and perhaps to the salvation of that chapel. With Leo still in his arms, Ilara approached the basin. The golden thread of the elixir gushed incessantly, a miracle amidst the chaos. He dipped his hand again, feeling the warm, vibrant energy. This time, he did not throw the wine. Instead, he brought his hand to Leo's lips. The boy, with a weak moan, swallowed the golden liquid. A wave of warmth coursed through his small body, and his eyes, previously cloudy, opened. They were no longer fixed on the battle, but on his grandfather, with a clarity Ilara hadn't seen in days. A faint but genuine smile appeared on his lips. The Guardian, having pushed the abomination onto the defensive, perceived the Lord's movement, its eyes burning with golden fire, fixed on the man. With a warning roar, the Guardian extended one of its claws, not to attack, but to create a barrier of dark and golden energy between the Lord and the fountain. The barrier pulsed, a clear warning that the elixir was protected. The abomination, taking advantage of the Guardian's distraction, attempted one last, desperate attack. It contorted, and from its shapeless mass, an appendage longer and thinner than the others, like a shadow spear, shot towards the energy barrier, aiming for the basin. But the Guardian was ready. With a swift movement, it intercepted the attack, and the golden flames in its claws consumed the shadow spear, making it vanish in a hiss of darkness. The creature, now visibly smaller and weaker, let out a shriek of defeat. The aura of rot around it diminished, and its multiple eyes contracted into a gaze of hatred and fear. It was no longer the relentless force from before. The wine of angels, through the Guardian, had wounded its essence. The abomination, with one last, desperate movement, began to retract, to dissolve into the deepest shadows of the chapel, seeking refuge in the darkness from which it had emerged. The battle was far from over, but the tide had turned. Hope now was not just a thread, but a golden river flowing through the heart of the chapel, promising not only healing, but a new dawn. The abomination, now a pale spectre of its former dark glory, shrieked one last time, a sound that echoed like the lament of a lost soul. It writhed no longer with fury, but with a desperate attempt to escape. Its multiple opaque eyes fixed on the Guardian, not with hatred, but with a primordial terror. The shapeless mass began to retract, to merge with the deepest shadows of the chapel, seeking refuge in the darkness from which it had emerged. The Guardian, however, did not allow it. With a roar that seemed to tear the very air, it raised its claws, wreathed in golden flames. It was not a blow to annihilate, but to seal. It extended its arms, and the dark and golden aura around it expanded, forming an energy cage that surrounded the retreating creature. The abomination struggled, its tentacles whipping uselessly against the invisible barrier, but the power of the wine of angels in the Guardian was absolute. The energy cage contracted, compressing the mass of shadows until it became a tiny point of darkness, which was then pushed into a deep fissure in the chapel wall. A fissure that had previously seemed innocuous, but now pulsed with a sealing energy. With one last weak screech, the abomination disappeared and the fissure closed, not with stone, but with a shimmering barrier of golden light and intertwined shadows, an eternal seal. A heavy silence descended upon the chapel, broken only by the ragged breaths of the Lord's men and the faint weeping of the Lord himself. He, oblivious to the abomination's defeat, still crawled towards the fountain, his eyes fixed on the golden elixir. "Mine! It's mine!" he muttered, his voice a pathetic shadow of his former arrogance. The energy barrier the Guardian had created between him and the fountain pulsed with a clear warning, but the Lord's greed had transformed into a blind obsession. He reached out his hand, ignoring the warnings, ignoring the danger. The moment his filthy fingers touched the energy barrier, there was no explosion, but an absorption. The barrier did not repel him, but enveloped him. The darkness that still permeated the chapel air, the remnants of the abomination, seemed to be drawn to him, to the stain of his soul. The Lord screamed, not from physical pain, but from a terror that came from within, from his own corruption. The energy barrier closed around him, not killing him, but imprisoning him in a bubble of darkness and light, a prison that reflected his own greed and isolated him from the light of the wine of angels. He fell, struggling, but his screams were muffled, and his movements became slow, as if trapped in amber. His men, seeing their master's fate, did not hesitate. With renewed terror, they crawled out of the chapel, disappearing into the blizzard, their figures dissolving in the white fury outside. Ilara, with Leo in his arms, watched the scene with a mixture of relief and awe. The guardian, now standing, looked more like a dark angel than a skeleton, its golden eyes fixed on him, and there was an almost imperceptible nod. The threat had been contained. He looked at Leo. The boy, who had previously been pale and feverish, now had a faint blush on his cheeks. His eyes were open, clear and bright, fixed on him. A genuine, life-filled smile spread across his face, and he reached out a small hand to touch his grandfather's face. "Grandfather," he whispered, his voice weak but audible, the first clear word he had heard from him in days. Tears streamed down Ilara's face, not from sadness, but from overwhelming joy. The wine of angels had fulfilled its promise. The chapel, once a place of despair and darkness, now radiated a soft, golden light. The guardian, its mission accomplished, retreated into the shadows, not disappearing but taking up its vigil, a silent and protective presence. The flow of the wine of angels from the fountain never ceased, a golden river of hope and healing. Ilara knew he couldn't stay there forever. The blizzard outside still roared, but the storm in their hearts had passed. Leo was cured, and with the wine of angels, they had a future. He approached the fountain again, not with greed, but with reverence. He filled the Lord's canteen, now cleansed of its stain, with the golden elixir. It was more than enough for Leo, and for anyone who needed it. As he turned to leave, Ilara felt a warmth in his chest. It wasn't just the warmth of the wine, but the feeling of a new life, a new chance. He looked back at the chapel, at the guardian watching from the shadows, at the fountain gushing liquid gold. This place, which had been his refuge and his battlefield, was now a sanctuary of miracles. He was no longer the helpless widower, but the guardian of a hope, the bearer of a secret worth more than gold. With Leo safe in his arms, his faint laughter echoing in the chapel, Ilara climbed the ruined stairs. The blizzard outside was still relentless, but he no longer felt the cold. In his heart, the warmth of the wine of angels burned, a promise of a new dawn, of a future where darkness would always be overcome by light, and hope, however faint, would always find a way to shine. They emerged from the buried chapel, no longer as victims of fate, but as heralds of a miracle, ready to face the world, armed with the most precious cure the earth had ever known.